Tonight, new intelligence reveals how a $412,000 investment in consumer-grade technology is systematically dismantling Russia's multi-billion-dollar energy infrastructure, and the implications extend far beyond fuel prices. What we're witnessing is a fundamental shift in modern warfare economics that defense planners in Washington, Beijing, and Brussels are studying very carefully. This isn't just another battlefield update. This is a case study in how asymmetric warfare is rewriting the rules of deterrence. Good evening, my name is Robert Harrison, independent journalist. Tonight I'll analyze how Ukrainian long-range drone operations against Russian oil refineries expose critical vulnerabilities in conventional air defense doctrine, vulnerabilities that could redefine deterrence strategy for the next generation. More importantly, I'll explain what this means for American defense spending, NATO planning, and the future of conflicts with near-peer adversaries. Let's start with the hard data, because numbers don't lie even when governments do. Since January 2024, Ukrainian forces have struck 21 of Russia's 38 major refineries, marking a systematic campaign that goes far beyond opportunistic attacks. According to Reuters analysts, these strikes have disabled approximately 10% of Russia's total refining capacity. But here's where the numbers reveal something critical. Between January and May 2024, gasoline production dropped by 20%, while diesel output fell by 11%. That's disproportionate impact compared to the raw capacity numbers, which tells us Ukrainian planners aren't just hitting targets randomly. They're striking critical nodes that create cascading failures throughout the entire system. The economic implications are substantial and measurable. 74% of Russian drivers have noticed gasoline price increases since August 2025, and 90% expect further increases according to recent polling. Over the past year, gasoline prices rose by 10.85%, while diesel increased by 8.56%. The Russian government has been forced to ban fuel exports multiple times to maintain domestic supply, and there are credible reports of hour-long queues at filling stations in major cities. This isn't just economic inconvenience. This is political pressure that directly affects public support for the war, and the Kremlin knows it. You can control state media, but you can't spin away empty gas stations. But what's really keeping Pentagon analysts awake at night is the cost asymmetry, and this is where American taxpayers should pay close attention. Ukraine is deploying drones that cost between $20,000 and $50,000 per unit. Russia's S-400 interceptor missiles, $2 million each. The Pantsir system fires missiles costing hundreds of thousands of dollars at targets that, in some documented cases, are literally aluminum foil corner reflectors designed to mimic cruise missiles. Think about that equation for a moment. Defenders are burning through their most expensive munitions against threats that cost less than a used Honda Civic. Let me explain why this matters for American defense policy, because this isn't just Russia's problem. According to a 2023 Royal United Services Institute report, one of the most respected defense think tanks in the world, Russia's air defenses were designed to counter traditional threats like manned aircraft and ballistic missiles, but struggle against swarms of small, inexpensive drones. Now here's the uncomfortable truth that nobody in the Pentagon wants to say out loud. This is the exact same challenge US forces face globally. We've spent decades and hundreds of billions of dollars perfecting systems to shoot down $2 million cruise missiles and sophisticated fifth-generation fighter jets. But a $30,000 drone flying 50 meters above the ground, using terrain masking and commercial GPS? That's a fundamentally different problem, and our current systems aren't optimized for it. Consider what happened on November 15, 2025. Ukrainian forces destroyed 4 S-400 launchers and 2 critical radars at Russia's Novorossiysk air defense hub. That single strike temporarily halted oil exports through a terminal handling roughly 2.2 million barrels per day, about 2% of global supply. Let that sink in for a moment. One successful drone operation, costing perhaps $500,000 in total equipment and planning, affected global energy markets. The strategic leverage is extraordinary. The return on investment would make any Wall Street trader jealous. The vulnerability isn't just operational, it's structural, and understanding this is crucial. The Pantsir system, which is supposed to be Russia's answer to drone threats, is effective against targets within a 20-kilometer radius, but can be overwhelmed by coordinated attacks or outmaneuvered by drones with advanced navigation systems. Russia has responded by unveiling an upgraded Pantsir carrying 48 mini-missiles specifically designed to counter drones. But this reactive approach highlights the fundamental asymmetry. Defenders must succeed every single time, every single night. Attackers only need to succeed once to achieve their objective. Here's what the technical specifications don't tell you, but combat footage reveals. The S-400 uses semi-active radar homing missiles that need continuous radar illumination from ground stations. When drones dive below the radar horizon, exploiting the curvature of the Earth, those multi-million-dollar missiles become ballistic projectiles, essentially expensive artillery shells with no guidance. Ukrainian operators have systematically figured this out, and they're exploiting it with remarkable sophistication. They'll send decoy drones high to trigger missile launches, then immediately dive those decoys, causing Russian missiles to detonate in empty air, while the real attack drones approach from completely different vectors at terrain-following altitude. The Ukrainian Security Service had claimed that Ukraine had destroyed some 48% of Russian Pantsir systems, while Russia manufactures only 30 per year according to defense industry sources. Now, intelligence claims should always be treated skeptically, especially during wartime, but even if that figure is inflated by 50%, the attrition rate still exceeds production capacity. This is ultimately a war of industrial endurance, and the side that can produce cheaper, faster, and in greater quantities holds a decisive advantage. Now let's talk about the broader geopolitical context, because this has direct implications for American interests and alliance commitments. Ukraine's expanding arsenal of domestically produced long-range weapons is particularly important at a time of growing uncertainty over the future of U.S. military aid. The incoming administration has signaled interest in brokering a compromise peace deal, which has Kyiv desperately seeking deterrence capabilities that don't depend on Western supply chains or political wins in Washington. President Zelensky's so-called victory plan included a call for the supply of long-range missiles as part of a non-nuclear deterrence package. What he's really saying, stripped of diplomatic language, is this: if we can't rely on NATO membership or ironclad security guarantees, we need the proven ability to strike back powerfully at targets deep inside Russia. And these refinery strikes? They're the proof of concept. They're Ukraine's way of saying we can hurt you regardless of what Washington decides. The targeting strategy has evolved significantly over the past year, and this evolution tells us something important about Ukrainian strategic thinking. Earlier strikes often focused on refineries supplying Russia's domestic market, maximizing economic disruption and public discontent. But starting in the spring of 2024, Ukraine began concentrating on facilities critical to military logistics. This shift reflects increasingly sophisticated operational planning. They're not just hitting economic targets anymore to make headlines. They're targeting dual-use infrastructure that directly supports battlefield operations, like the fuel production facilities that supply Russian armored divisions and tactical aviation. But here's what they're not telling you, and this is where American policy gets genuinely complicated. In March 2024, the Financial Times reported that U.S. officials had explicitly asked Ukraine to stop targeting Russian energy infrastructure, fearing that these attacks could drive up global oil prices and potentially impact domestic gasoline costs during an election year. That request reveals the inherent tension in American policy, supporting Ukraine's fight for survival while simultaneously managing global economic stability and domestic political considerations. It's the kind of nuanced policy challenge that doesn't fit into sound bites but has real consequences. The fact that Ukraine largely ignored that request and continued the strikes using domestically produced drones highlights another critical point. American leverage over Ukrainian operations is fundamentally limited to weapon systems we directly supply. If Ukraine develops its own long-range strike capabilities, and they demonstrably have, then our ability to constrain their targeting decisions diminishes significantly. This has profound implications for future conflicts, where we support partners who develop indigenous military capabilities. The implications for NATO planning are profound and deserve serious examination by alliance members. Russia's oil refineries are facing repeated methodical attacks, and defense analysts compare it to being repeatedly punched. No single punch is fatal, but it becomes progressively harder to recover after each subsequent blow. Eventually, cumulative damage exceeds repair capacity and you reach a tipping point. This death by 1,000 cuts approach circumvents Russia's nuclear deterrent entirely. You can't credibly threaten nuclear retaliation against small autonomous drones when you can't even reliably detect or engage them. This fundamentally undermines the traditional deterrence calculus that has defined great power relations since 1945. For American taxpayers, here's why this should matter to your wallet and your security. We've invested hundreds of billions of dollars in systems like the Patriot, THAAD, and Aegis, magnificent engineering achievements designed primarily for Cold War scenarios, shooting down ballistic missiles, enemy aircraft, and supersonic cruise missiles. But Ukraine is demonstrating in real time that the future of warfare may belong to whoever can mass-produce sophisticated drones at commercial electronics prices. We're watching legacy platforms, the kind that take a decade to develop and cost billions, struggle against distributed low-cost threats that can be designed and deployed in months. Throughout 2024, Ukraine launched at least 81 documented attacks on Russian oil facilities, according to BBC News Russian calculations based on open-source intelligence. The Russian Energy Ministry stopped publishing gasoline production statistics in mid-year, officially citing information security concerns. But let's be honest about what that means. When governments suddenly stop releasing economic data during wartime, that usually tells you the data isn't favorable, and they don't want their own population or international markets seeing the real numbers. Some Ukrainian drones are now reaching targets 630 kilometers inside Russian territory, striking facilities like the Penza microelectronics plant. That's roughly the distance from Ukraine's border to Moscow itself. If Ukrainian drones can reach Penza with enough payload to cause significant damage, they can theoretically reach any target in European Russia, including the Kremlin, major military production facilities, and strategic command centers. The psychological impact of this capability cannot be overstated. Russian citizens in cities that were supposed to be safe rear areas, far from the front lines, are now experiencing war directly through air raid sirens and explosions. That fundamentally changes public perception and political calculations in ways that battlefield victories alone cannot achieve. Russia's response has been predictable but strategically costly, creating dilemmas with no good solutions. They're redeploying air defense systems from frontline positions to protect critical infrastructure in the rear. Every Pantsir battery pulled back to protect a refinery or government building is one less battery providing air cover for ground forces facing Ukrainian artillery and HIMARS strikes. Every S-400 system repositioned to defend Moscow or St. Petersburg is one less system providing air superiority for tactical aviation near the actual combat zone. Moscow faces an impossible choice: protect the strategic rear and suffer tactical defeats, or maintain frontline air defense and watch your economic infrastructure burn. Let's talk about implications beyond Ukraine, because this is where American strategic planners are genuinely focused. If these relatively simple drones, built with commercial components and open-source flight controllers, can penetrate Russia's integrated air defense network, one of the most sophisticated and layered in the world, what does that mean for the survivability of U.S. carrier battle groups against Chinese drone swarms in a Taiwan scenario? China has been investing heavily in autonomous systems, AI-guided munitions, and mass production capabilities. The tyranny of distance across the Pacific was supposed to protect American power projection. But if drones can fly 600+ kilometers autonomously, navigate using AI vision systems, and coordinate attacks using mesh networks, then the standoff ranges we've relied upon for decades may no longer provide adequate protection. If Ukraine can build 630-kilometer range strike platforms domestically using commercially available technology and some clever engineering, what prevents non-state actors from acquiring similar capabilities? Hezbollah already uses drones. Iranian-backed militias in Iraq and Yemen have demonstrated increasing sophistication. The technological barrier to entry for long-range strike capabilities is dropping rapidly, and that has profound implications for force protection, homeland security, and regional stability worldwide. The United States has reportedly provided intelligence assistance that helps Ukraine plan long-range strikes on Russian energy infrastructure, including satellite imagery, signals intelligence, and targeting packages. That support, however carefully calibrated or indirect, makes Washington a participant in economic warfare against a nuclear-armed power. The precedent being established here will echo through international relations for decades. Future adversaries will cite this precedent to justify their own infrastructure strikes against American interests, allies, or partners. What happens next depends on several critical factors. Can Ukraine maintain the pace and scale of attacks as Russia adapts its defenses and potentially targets Ukrainian drone production facilities? Can Russia develop effective countermeasures faster than Ukraine iterates its attack methods and technologies? Will the incoming U.S. administration continue supporting Ukraine's indigenous weapons development, either directly through aid or tacitly through intelligence sharing? And perhaps most importantly, will Western defense establishments learn the correct lessons from this conflict and adapt accordingly? Or will bureaucratic inertia and entrenched interests ensure we continue investing in legacy platforms optimized for the last war rather than the next one? The lesson for defense policymakers worldwide is profoundly uncomfortable but impossible to ignore. Expensive, exquisite, sophisticated weapon systems designed for traditional peer conflict may be functionally obsolete before they're fully deployed at scale. The F-35 program has cost American taxpayers over $1.7 trillion across its life cycle. A single aircraft carrier battle group represents an investment exceeding $10 billion. But if a coordinated swarm of $50,000 drones can overwhelm their defensive systems, what does that massive investment actually buy us in terms of real-world deterrence and combat capability? This isn't just about Ukraine and Russia. What we're watching in real time is a live-fire stress test of 21st-century warfare doctrine. and the results should genuinely concern anyone thinking about potential future conflicts with China, Iran, North Korea, or any adversary capable of mass-producing autonomous systems. The question at this point isn't whether drones and autonomous weapons will dominate future conflicts. They already demonstrably do. The question is whether Western defense establishments, with their decades-old procurement processes and institutional cultures, can adapt their strategies, doctrine, and industrial base before the next major crisis proves conclusively that they haven't. The Ukrainian campaign against Russian oil infrastructure represents nothing less than a paradigm shift in strategic thinking about power projection and coercion. Small, distributed, relatively inexpensive platforms are achieving strategic effects that previously required heavy bombers, cruise missile salvos, or high-risk special operations forces insertions. The cost-benefit ratio is revolutionary. The scalability is extraordinary. And the implications for how we fundamentally think about deterrence, defense investment, and power projection are still being processed and debated by strategic communities worldwide. That's the analysis for tonight. Thank you.